All right. Welcome, everybody, to 52 Living Ideas. I am delighted to be presenting on the topic of principles. I'm a little bit scared because it's one of the most complex presentations I have attempted. I'm presenting based on the work of Mortimer Adler in Great Books. The greatest part of Great Books is the Syntopicon, where they summarize, where they identify these 103 ideas around which the entire Western conversation revolves. So today, we are talking about principle. So let us begin. This is the outline of what I'm planning to talk about. I've gone through the chapter. It's a short chapter. I recommend that you read it. It is just 8 pages, 8-page summary of what everybody throughout history has thought about principles. So first, we're going to talk about what are principles. What are they? So that's, what is the heart of it? And I'm going to try to describe it in several ways, and hopefully some of them will resonate with you. Now, I want to point out that this is a particularly difficult topic to talk about at this time because our culture, especially the American culture in the 20th and 21st century, especially the 21st century or late half of the 20th century, is a subjectivist culture. So principle is a very foreign concept. All of these ideas have their own life cycle. They're born at certain times, they grow at some times, and they start to die. So this idea is kind of at the low ebb in the current times. So it is actually difficult to grasp this idea. So that's what makes it particularly hard. So first I'm going to talk about what are principles. Then I'm going to talk about one of the critical issues about principles. Where are they? What is the base of principles? Are they in existence? Are they in consciousness? Neither, both. What is the story? Third, I'm going to talk about one of the biggest issue that comes up when anybody thinks about principles, and that is the idea of first principles. Where do you start? Okay. Now, this is up to here is just a pure attempt to summarize and present in a graspable way the presentation that the great books did on principles. But I didn't want to stop there because our meetups are focused on applying ideas. So I'm going to stick my neck out in the 4th slide, and I'm going to say, this is my understanding of principles. And I'm going to stick my neck further out in the 5th slide and say, these are my principles. These are the principles that I use, that I have found effective. Okay. And that gives you not only, what everybody has thought about it, my take on principles as such, and then what my principles are and how I use it. So hopefully this will be much more usable than just an academic presentation of principles. All right. So let's dive into this. Okay, what are principles? So when you look at the etymology of principles in Latin, it refers to a beginning or a foundation, a starting point, the place, the resting place on which everything else is built, place of beginning. There are 2 uses of principles. Think of principles as principles for action. This could be moral principles. This could be principles of operation. This could be political principles. All these principles are used in 2 ways. On one hand, and both these ways are connected to each other. First, there are rules of conduct. How do you conduct yourself? Second, as a corollary, they act as standards to judge actions. One of the core things about principles is that they are general statements. The generality is the crucial part of principles. Suppose you had 3,792 principles, those are going to be completely useless because you would not know, you wouldn't be able to use it. So this is all about coming up with few general notions that you can apply to everything. And applying to everything is crucial aspect of principles. There is a quality in principles of being underlying, being the source of things. When you're getting at principles, you're trying to get at few most general percepts from which others can be derived. There are two ways of looking at principles. One is that you can look at it in temporal order, and second, you can look at them in logical order. So you can think of them as that from which knowledge develops in temporal order of learning. What are the starting points of learning? Or you can also look at it in terms of that upon which knowledge rests in logical order. So these are two ways of using it. Aristotle talks about three different kinds of starting points. Principles arrived at through induction, which he calls general principles, through perceptions, perception as being the source, sensory base, and through habituation, and this he calls moral principles. So this is roughly what principles are. There are various ways of describing principles. Now, this is the biggest issue regarding principles. This is actually a biggest issue regarding knowledge itself, and it shows up in principles in spades. Are principles in existence or in consciousness? Are they there, out there? So for example, people like Plato hold that there are actual principles out there. There are forms out there in reality. Aristotle is kind of in the middle. He's Platonic with a twist. He talks about it as aspects of existence. So some element of consciousness he brings in. William James, his idea is very different from these two. So he talks about intuitive propositions that state necessary and eternal relations. So firstly, they're intuitive. So that's like your consciousness grasps them as necessary and eternal relations. So they're products of consciousness, which the mind finds between certain of its ideal conceptions. So you're trying to actually integrate everything that you know in your idea, a beautiful network of ideas created by the mind, held hypothetically, hoping to correspond to outer reality checked by perception. So what you're trying to, this view is that it is being done by consciousness in order to capture reality. So this is kind of both. It is a product of consciousness, and you're relentlessly trying to achieve correspondence to reality. You're also looking for several characteristics that they're beautiful, they are well organized, they're kind of ideal conceptions. So what you're trying to do is that you're trying to make them easy to hold in your mind, at the same time correspond to reality. So you can see that there is a kind of a combination of both consciousness here and existence. People like Plato, Aristotle, Spinoza, and Kant would come down on the side of it being in existence. Now, people have different ways of forming it. So Kant would say that it is there in the structure of mind itself, but that just is. It's not something that consciousness does. So principles describe the nature and existence of things outside the human mind. And on the other side are the skeptics of various kinds. So people like Hume hold that there are principles, but they are only for things like mathematics, which is created by consciousness. These are rules within domains which are created by consciousness. and everything that is out there is only probabilistic. Montaigne goes further and says principles are simply dreams and vapors. And subjectivists in the modern day are, build on that. They are mostly focused on the fact that this is their view is that they are products of consciousness and have very little to do with existence. So you have this entire range of things. So it's existence, purely in existence, purely in consciousness, like Montaigne, purely in existence, like Plato, and then there is something in between, like a combination of the two, like in William James. Okay, so those are issues. Again, these are the issues about knowledge itself, but they very much, apply at a crucial level to principles, because principles are foundations of knowledge. These are the first principles of knowledge. So let's come to the topic of first principles. Now, metaphysics is the discipline which contemplates and considers absolutely first or most universal principles. So metaphysics is where most of the, large part of the discussion of principles rest. Are first principles immediately intuited from particulars of experience or reached only through stages of generalizations? This is a very large issue. Are they immediate, or are they achieved after generalization? What is the basis of this principle? So Kant says that the structure of the mind is the base of principles. Aquinas says that it is natural habit of the mind, which is the base. Mill says that to be incapable of proof by reasoning is common to all first principles, to the first premises of our knowledge, as well as to those of our conduct. Okay. Let me move this around here. Aquinas says the intellectual law, this is his take on first principles of two areas, the principle of intellect and principle of morality. He says the intellectual law is the same thing, cannot be affirmed and denied at the same time. This is directly from Aristotle. And then the moral law is good is to be done and evil is to be avoided. That's the starting point of morality. So these are some examples of what first principles look like. Okay. The other crucial argument that people like Aristotle have about first principles is first principles are those that even when you're trying to deny the first principle, you are either implicitly accepting it or you are resulting in absurdity. So that's how Aristotle defends first principles. So this is briefly about first principles. Now, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to dive into what I think. So far, I've spent about 15 minutes kind of giving you an overview, quick overview of what different people have thought about principles. And now I'm going to talk about what I think about principles. Okay, so this is my understanding of principles. So one of the things that I was astonished by was that nowhere in this chapter people talked about why do we need principles at all? And I think that's the first question to ask. Okay, why do we need principles? And I think we need principles because life is very complex and we are very complex. And we need to figure out what we need to do and we need to act. And in order to do that, in order to act in a complex world, we need principles. Principles are simple. It's a way of thinking about the complexity of life and reducing it to the simple essential elements which serve as a basis for action. That's what you're trying to do when you are trying to work on principles. Okay. So let me focus for a moment the idea of simplicity. Okay. So again, this diagram of hourglass is how I think of principles. What you're trying to do is that you're trying to take all your experience and you're trying to boil it down. You're trying to come up with the most essential things which capture the gist of everything that you need to hold in your mind. So it is that hourglass point is where the principles are, and which serves as a source for all your actions. And then the hourglass, just like you can reverse it, imagine that whatever is on the right hand side is flowing back into the left hand side, and plus new things are coming in there from reality. And this is going on a continual basis, and you develop your principles like that. And you need this point in the middle to be effective at action. Okay, so that's the basic idea I have of principles. Um, so now let me talk about simple. So it needs to be as simple as possible. Okay, this is Einstein's point. You have to make things as simple as possible, but not simpler. So it has to be. Firstly, it has to be sufficient. So suppose let's take the example. Suppose you come up with two principles. Then you have to ask yourself, does that cover everything that you need to keep in mind? Are these sufficient? If not, you need to add to them. Suppose you keep adding to them and now you have 24 principles. You have to say, are all of them necessary? Can you reduce them? Are some of them superfluous? Are they some repetitions? Can they be formulated in a way where they can be held more simply? So you're trying to push towards things as simple as possible, but no simpler. So they have to cover everything in as simple and as short number as possible, so you can hold it in your mind and use them easily. Because the ultimate thing that you're trying to do is not just to know, but you're trying to know in order to act. So there is a feedback loop between knowledge and action. You're trying to hold all your knowledge in as simple terms as possible so you can act effectively on it. So let me talk about it let me address the point about existence and consciousness. So they are the product of consciousness and reality. So the best way I know of thinking about them is map and territory. So reality is territory. And what you're trying to form, knowledge itself, is a map. And you're continuously trying to come up with a map that captures the territory. Also remember that this is not an idle map making pursuit. Imagine that you are a military person where you're trying to form maps to guide your action. Okay, so those maps are going to guide your action. So they have to capture the territory in a way which is actionable to you. And the territory is continuously changing. Your map is continuously changing in response to it. So that is the idea of, I think that's the best way I know of thinking about knowledge, that knowledge is map of territory that you use in order to guide your actions. I want to talk about scale of living. If you want to live, in our evolutionary heritage, we lived in a group of 30 people, everybody whom we knew, the environment that didn't change that much. Our brain and ability to see patterns is good enough to handle that kind of a situation. But moment we go into a larger, when we start dealing with 500 people in a city, when the scale goes up, the importance of principles rises, because the number of choices you have, the number of options that you have, number of interactions that you have, number of experiences that you have, number of situations you will find yourself in, just keeps increasing dramatically. At the same time, your ability to pay attention is still limited. That is your bottleneck. What principles do is that they tell you what you need to pay attention to in order to live effectively in a complex world. Okay, so principles are especially important, in the post-evolutionary world, after the advent of cities and writing. Um, so that's my general take on principles. This is what I think about principles. Now, for example, one of our regulars here, Shelley, talked about her principle of not letting fear shape, determine her destiny. Now, that's a principle. That's a principle. See, this is a very good example of a principle, something that you can hold in your mind that will guide your action across countless number of situations. Okay, so that's a good example. Or my favorite principle that I have used is Louis Sullivan's principle of form follows function. Okay, so these are some examples of principles. I mean, form follows function, I found that I can bring that to bear on any situation at any time, and it produces very interesting results. It allows me to, so let me talk a minute about that. Okay, that, I mean, if I have to choose one principle that I have used for a long period of time that has been very effective in almost every situation, that is that, form follows function. I've done a full meetup on that. So you can look up, Louis Sullivan in 52 Living Ideas YouTube, and you can see it. Um, the reason for that is that the way we work is that we are living beings. And in order to live, we produce structures that make scale of life possible. Principles are one of them, chairs are others, social systems are others. These are all forms that we create in order to live. The standard for judging them is whether they meet this requirement of living in each context or not. Very often it's a lot of work, a lot of thinking to produce good forms, whether it is a chair or a new word or a new book or structure of an organization or a country. All of them, it's a lot of work. And what most people do is that they hold on to the form and try to use the form while forgetting the function. You see this in religions, in fields, everywhere, in companies that were really growing at one point kind of get to a point where they become ossified. And so this form follows function is a constant reminder of always looking at the function that is behind the form and reworking the form accordingly. So those are a couple of examples of principles. Now, I'm going to stick my neck further out and talk about my principles currently. Okay, this is very new. I've been using just that one principle, form follows function, but I've combined this with another line of thought that I've been pursuing about trying to capture all that human beings do in a very few elements. So here goes. So this is my diagram that I've been using for some time now about the 4 human functions. And so I have now 5 principles. Okay, so let me describe them. I'm just going to run through them very quickly. So the center still remains form follows function, but I use different formulations of it. Okay, you have to make the principles your own. Okay, that is very important. The it's not how somebody else views the principle. You have to formulate it in a way that speaks to you and the way that you can use it. So form follows function for me is too passive because it doesn't really follow that way. You actually have to create the form. So I think functions creating the form, function creates forms is a much more, actually I have a much more concise version that is, it is functionate forms. So that means you're trying to do, so it's like, I wanted to point these various formulations to you to say that even when you learn a function from somebody else, even when you learn a principle from somebody else, you have to make it your own, because you have to not only get, when you go back to the diagram here, you have to be able to, the principle is the one right here in the middle. Even when somebody else has produced it for you, it is not useful to you until you make it your own. So you have to go and connect it to your own experience of where the input is. Then you have to see, you have to use it in various ways and use that experience in order to reformulate it in a way that you find it most usable. Okay, so that is, so in that sense, it is very, on one hand, it is very personal. On the other hand, it is objective. It is capturing a lot of existence. It's capturing a lot of your action, but it is also the way in which you can hold it and use it in your mind. So function creates its own forms is the kind of core principles that I come up with. If I have time to use only one principle, I would use only that. Now, the rest of the four principles connect with kind of the four functions that I think human beings have to do. This is based on, partly the work of Daniel Kahneman when it comes to like system 1 and system 2. The red here is system 1. The yellow here is system 2. My mistake. The yellow here is system 1 and blue here is system 2. So that's system 1 and system 2. But I also find that there is external things. So there is your actual physical action of your body, and that's what I call that's the red. The principle I have there is, I would say, pursue your values. That you have to act towards your values. That's a crucial thing. And the green is the most complex. It's the last thing that has developed, and that is you have to integrate with civilization. You're living in this entire civilization. You have to integrate with all kind of various social structures that are out there effectively in order to live. So those are the four. Let me quickly go through the four. In the evolutionary order, it is the first, the action that came to be, where we are living beings are acting. Action is what we do. So that's the red part. Then we developed a brain capable of guiding the action wordlessly. This is even before human beings. That's our brain being able to see patterns. That's yellow over there. Then we developed a reasoning faculty, a deliberating faculty, able to check against reality what we are doing. That's system 2, that is blue. And then as a result of that, we built a civilization where we could work together to achieve things on a scale that was just impossible before. So those are the four things. And so given that I think that there are these four things, and the center there is basically your kind of core principle that is applicable everywhere to all these four things. So that's kind of holding all these four things together, making sure that each of these functions is in its rightful place, and each of them is engaging in your life. And that is the job of the kind of principle in the center. So the principles for each of them at the action level, the principle is pursue your values. This is, Jordan Peterson's idea of pursuing your values. This is the importance of acting. It just comes from the fact that we are living beings. The second principle is intuit your path. Our ability, we have a very large brain, and our emotional ability, our intuitive ability is very significant. Many times you notice things at the edge. You may not have explicitly put it. You first notice it is kind of, this doesn't feel right, or I'm scared of that, or something like that. You first feel things. You first notice things. So being open to that, listening to that, is very important as a starting point. But it is not an end in itself. The next one, I call it update your priors. This is my way of saying reason, my way of saying deliberate, question your actions, question your intuitions, question the systems that are out there in civilization. So update your priors is my way. Priors is whatever was there before, whatever you held before. Don't, we are creatures of habit. We will, if we don't watch out, we will just continue to do whatever we do, whatever we've been doing. So this is a reminder to engage your reasoning faculty, deliberative faculty. And finally, integrate with civilization. We are social beings. We have tremendous to gain from integrating with civilization. Do that. So figure out how to do that in order to achieve your values. So those are the four, so these are the 5 principles. I use my hand for that. This is the first principle. Function creates form. Then this is for integrating the civilization. This one is update your priors, intuit your path, pursue your values. I find it very easy. I use both hands, so I can count it on my hands. I can look at a problem. I can say, what principles do I need to engage in what order right now? People are different. The order in which you engage the principles, order in which you engage the principle in different situations is different. But I find that this set of principles gives me a very powerful tool to use principles. Okay, so that was a quick overview of principles. So let me just quickly recap here, go back about what we've talked about so far, and I'm going to open it up for questions. If you have questions, just go ahead and type an exclamation mark. Mostly questions at this stage. And then what we will do is that we will do breakout rooms and then come back with your takeaways. And I will listen to everything that you have to say very carefully, and then look at all the themes, and then talk about all the themes that come out of that. Okay, so let's go for questions. So I just want to remind you that what we've talked about is what are principles, our principles in existence of consciousness. We talked briefly about first principles, then I've talked about my understanding of principles. Okay, so let me stop sharing here. All right. Kevin.
Hey, thank you, Frank. It's good stuff. My question, can you give us one example for your principle about the for a subsystem to form a function formula form?
One example. So for example, let's say these meetups, right? So I'm continuously saying, what is the function of this meetup? And is the form right for it? And I'm continuously looking at every aspect of it. Let's say, for example, I'm saying the basic format is that there is a presentation, there is a Q&A, there is a breakout rooms, and there is the takeaways. Why is that? Why is each of them necessary? What presentations do each, what is the, so there is the function of the meetup is what I call the overall function of the meetup is joint exploration of the world, ourselves, and ideas. That's what I'm trying to do here. Okay, so that's the function of the meetup. So firstly, when you ask the question, what is the function of something, that itself takes you to a completely new level, because you're now saying, okay, that is what I have to achieve, right? Now, how do you achieve it? Okay, so the form that I've used is these 4 parts. Okay, so I'm looking at just first step. So why have a presentation? Because the presentation brings different ideas from the world and puts it on the table for all of us to explore. Otherwise, there isn't too much that we can all focus on and explore in depth. That is the function of the presentation. Q&A is to get clarifications about the presentation so that it is clear. It's, even though the presenter is trying their best to present as best as possible, they are limited by their own perspective. They get used to certain ideas. So it's important to let other people ask for clarifications so that whatever is presented is clear. So that is like elaboration, clarification of the presentation of what is put on the table. Then the heart of it is the breakout rooms, where they're designed in small groups, so you can actually engage in close inspection, going back and forth, asking, okay, why do you think that? Oh, I think that. Oh, that's interesting. And going back and forth and having a real discussion. But of its necessity, its forms needs to be a small group, so you can have that communication. And then when we come back together, you get the advantage of all the thinking that has happened in the breakout rooms, plus individuals' conclusions from that. And then we try to identify common themes and talk about that as a wrap up, so people can go away with kind of things. So this is a way, a very elaborately designed form in order to achieve the function of joint exploration of the world, ideas, and ourselves. Okay, next up is Joe, Paul, Shelley, and Jonathan. Joe.
Thank you, Shrikant. Fantastic presentation. I very much enjoyed it. I was just wondering for the middle, as far as its form follows function, is it more? Could you be like you replace that with maybe design thinking, where each person can choose their own approach to how they're going to actually form and create their own life? That's the way I was thinking about it. Is that a possibility?
Absolutely, absolutely. So that's where your kind of design thinking is. This is like something, some idea that applies to everything. Okay. Now, for me, form follows function is the principle in that place. But different people could have, like, for example, you know, um, Buckminster Fuller would say macro comprehensive, micro incisive.
Right.
Okay, and that's a general principle. Okay, that he can bring to bear on anything that he's looking at. So different people can come up with different principle, and what we should do is that you should look at everything that can serve in that function and see which one you find most potent. Okay, now it's not as if that this principle stands alone. So this macro comprehensive, when take for example, macro comprehensive and micro incisive, right? Each of the principles has a slightly different way of focusing on things. So macro comprehensive is reminding you of, it's like a funnel. It's saying, take in everything and then bring it to bear on anything. So bring everything to bear on anything, something like that. So it has a certain kind of emphasis. So many times you might be able to keep like multiple principles in that place, in that first place. And you could use different ones depending on which one is more effective. So absolutely, each person would have different, go ahead.
And that's how universals and particulars can kind of interact with one another as well, right? In that
Right.
format.
I mean, what you're holding in that central place are universals, which you can bring to bear on anything. But there are multiple options
Right.
that are there. But so it is kind of objective in the sense that they have to be effective at taking in reality and acting on reality. But ways of doing that can be different. And so you definitely, so there is a combination of objective and subjective that is being achieved there. Uh,
Thank you.
you're welcome. Next up is Paul, Shelley, Jonathan, and Sarika. Paul.
Thanks, Srikant, for your ongoing saga as you refine your thoughts. I love being there to see it. I work with people in a role where I'm sometimes finding myself helping them define what we call core values. So I'd love for you to contrast the two terms. So someone in that kind of exercise might say, okay, honesty, that is, I will live, my actions will be based on true honesty. Faith, I'm just giving you the kinds of words: determination, love, fidelity to, integrity. So those are values, and people develop actions to live by them. and you're making principles and actions to live by them. So just contrast them for me and tell me.
Wonderful, wonderful, great question. So first thing I want to say that principles are arrived at through induction. So you're trying to bring together. So for example, let's take Louis Sullivan, right? He calls his autobiography autobiography of an idea. So this is like you have all kinds of experience and you use that. So for example, the process that you're talking about of identifying your values, that's a starting process of saying, okay, these are my values. And then they start to slowly coalesce together. Now, it is an intellectual feat and it is an actual achievement of kind of making them come together in a way where they are not just isolated. Like if you have like these 12 different values that you have to kind of check separately, that's not as effective as if you can come up, as compared to if you could come up with something that kind of integrates them together and sees the relationship between them, maybe as a tree or something like that. So it's a process of integration. And so, for example, for me, it's like currently it is 5. I find that it also depends on like how your mind works. There's some people, they can hold a list of 10 and run through the list 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 easily. Some people, for them, like 3 is the best way to hold it. So you kind of have to you have to make it amenable to how you're going to use it, and that it should actually capture what you need to keep in mind in order to live. So you have to, so it is an inductive process, and what you are describing is a starting point of that. And you're trying, by actually asking people to explicate them, firstly is a major step forward, because normally many times most of the values people hold are implicit values. They never give full explication to it. So the act of explicating it is one step. Second step of doing that in a comprehensive way is even a step further. Then you're trying to kind of continuously organize it. And most importantly, then you start using it and you observe yourself how you're using it. And you keep transforming how you need to hold it. And I know that the different people are different. So the way in which people hold it is dramatically different. But you kind of have to, but I think the general pattern of the process is the same. Does that answer?
I think so. I think it's so you would say do the core values exercise, then you're ready to base your principles on the values.
So okay, so it's very interesting. So now there is a question of this brings us to a really interesting question of values and virtues. Okay, principles are essentially virtues. They are statements of virtues, that this is what is good. Like, functions, the form should be what is according to the function. It's a virtue statement, and that you should always try to do that. So values are the things that you're trying to attain. Virtues are the kinds of actions that will enable you to achieve values. So that's the connection between them. Now, and there is no contradiction. There is no conflict between them. It is values are the ends and virtues are the means. Now, it may turn out that some of your values are contradictory with each other or with virtues, in which case you have to question them. Okay. And having values does not by itself enable you to achieve it. You need to figure out what does it take to achieve it. So you do need to come up with virtues. So I think that distinction is important. But they are kind of both ways of trying to get at what should I be doing? And, so this is what I need to be pursuing. This is how I need to be pursuing it. Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Paul. Great question. Next up is Shelley, Jonathan, Sarika, and David.
First, I just want to say, Paul, thank you for asking that question, because that is not one of the questions I was going to ask, but whoa. I mean, I just had like a light bulb over my head experience go off with Shrikant's explanation and then what Joe put, principles drive values. my mind is blown. I'm wide awake where I was like crashing a few minutes ago. So, but Shrikant, here's my question.
Mhm.
Is there any way you could go to slide 2? Because I have a clarification question about
Sure.
something you said, and I don't understand the language in it. Like
Sure.
some of the words are confusing to me.
Sure.
So
Which one? This one?
it's the one that says, no, right there. No, go back.
This one?
Yeah, it says that from which knowledge develops in temporal order of learning, or that which knowledge rests in logical order. I think I understand logical order. I'm not really sure I understand what temporal order of learning, what that means.
Sure. I mean, this is like, for example, many philosophers like Locke or Hume hold that knowledge comes from sensory data. So they would say that sense perception is the first principle. That means that's where knowledge begins. Plato holds that it is direct intuition to forms that is the beginning. So it is trying to say, okay, where does the knowledge begin? That's how they see it. Now, I do not actually see it this way. Like the approach that I talked about. So let me think here. Okay, that from which knowledge develops in temporal order or logical.
Temporal order, is that implying the intuitive taking
No.
it in?
The temporal order simply means time, order in time. You know, what comes first? That's what it is saying. What comes first? So it's like they'll say all knowledge comes from perception. So perception is first in time. So that's all it is saying.
Okay. Okay, I'm gonna have to chew on that. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. But thank you very much for the compliments. Really appreciate that. Next up is Jonathan, Sarika, and David. Jonathan.
Hey, Shrikant, great presentation. I have like 10 questions, so I will just have to pick one for you.
Okay.
Actually, let me continue where Shelley left off, actually, because it is interesting to me too. When we're thinking about the distinction was temporal and logical, can you think of an example where I understand that you might learn something in a certain order in order to understand it, but in what case would you have something where the logical order is different from the temporal order that you learn something?
Right. I mean, let me talk about it, because what I'm trying to do here in the presentation is I'm trying to summarize what other people have thought. Okay. It is better for me to just tell you where I'm coming from and apply that question over there. So for example, for my principles, that as I think of it, they are temporally starting points of all action. So I'm acting from my principles, right there. I'm saying, let my actions be guided by my principles. So they are temporal. They are formed through induction. So from a lot of experience and trying to kind of piece together the experience. I'm doing a lot of logical thinking, starting with these principles. So it's say, okay, if form needs to follow function, in this case, what does it mean? So they are kind of logical starting points of that. Temporally, they come much later in the development, like by the time like Louis Sullivan arrives at the principle of form follows function, it's quite a bit into his life. So the principle is not temporally first. So in that sense, the way I'm thinking about principles, the temporal order really is not the right one, because temporal is simply the source. That's what, some philosophers think of it that way, but I don't think that's the right order. I think the logical order of saying, all the arguments, all the actions, everything is now based on these principles that have come to from induction. Does that make sense, Jonathan?
A little, yeah.
Okay.
I will ask another question later. So
okay, sounds good. Let's see who's next. Give me a second here. I lost the train here. Okay, next up is Sarika, followed by David. Sarika.
So I really enjoyed your presentation a lot, and especially like going to like your previous groups. It's all kind of coming together. And Another thing that I thought of is that this is very much like the machine learning development life cycle, where you might pick a goal of identifying maybe like a pattern in data of a demographic that might buy a certain product, and then you'll get the algorithms. Then you'll be able to like either expand the data points or not, etc. But one of the facets that's puzzling in machine learning is confirmation bias at the end of it, which is, okay, so your data tells you that it predicts that if you cater to this demographic, you'll sell a lot of products. But then you have to ask from a value and human virtue perspective, do you really want to be perpetuating the existing patterns? So that's like an error that comes up in machine learning, that it goes from the technical world to business level talk.
Yes.
And then at some point they should bring more like, humanities people in to have these debates about, what you're doing. But on a personal level, I really, really like these principles a lot. And yeah, it's
Thank you. So the way I would like to, thanks, sorry. So let me just talk briefly about that, the way in which I see, kind of my way of thinking here applies to that. So if you look at these slides here, right, these four things. So one of the things you're saying is that this updating your priors is very important. So this is the thing that actually guards against confirmation bias, getting too hung up on things. It also questions the kind of integrate with civilization. Are the systems out there the right systems? Okay, or are your intuitions that you're using the right intuition? So this part of kind of updating your priors is focused on asking exactly that kind of questions. Also, in the context of kind of using listen to your intuition, that is also very important, because many times what happens is that, yes, I'm being successful, but there is this kind of nagging feeling that you have, oh, there is something wrong here, and you have to listen to it, and you have to be able to explicate it and resolve that. That is another source. So in many ways, this is like a control system that is giving you kind of many ways of testing and checking. You're getting a check from external world, from that green part, by integrating with the world. You're getting a check from your intuitive system. You're getting a system. You're getting a check from your actual action, whether you're motivated to do this or not. Are you able to do it or not? You're getting a feedback loop from your deliberative system, and you're using all these things together. And form follows function is kind of rising one level up and seeing how is everything functioning. Is it all functioning right or something else? Thank you very much. Great question. Next up is David S., Paul S.T., and Jeff. David.
Yeah, you just modified a little what I was maybe going to ask. I was just following up what you were just saying. So I'm wondering where the act of sort of designing is. I think it's sort of an action, but you're really intuiting your path as you design. On the other hand, the function creates the form. So it's at that level that maybe you're designing. So I'm a little bit confused about that. Maybe you'll answer that. My original question was, where does this fit in? The need or the value of enhancing your own self and system, the way we do exactly what we do here. We use external sources to integrate them. We go study, we do comprehensivism to bring the external in. Well, how does that fit into which of these 5 principles, especially regarding focus study and training? Where is that in here?
Okay, so what is external? So integrate with civilization is where most of the kind of external input is coming from, because you're trying to take in all of civilization. You're trying to do things in civilization from as large a scale as possible. That's where the primary kind of input and output is going from that. in terms of comprehensivism, I think I would say that's where kind of the input is. Large part of the input is the yellow and blue are what your mind is doing. So it is using your intuitive faculty, your right brain, your kind of back brain. That's that part. And then blue is your rational faculty. It is a prefrontal brain, left brain, if you will, kind of top neocortex. So
Reason.
those, yeah, go ahead.
Reason, it's what one is your whole mind open to sense, imagination, design. The other is reasoning, the verification, deliberation.
Right. So both those are at the top. Okay, so the top parts, the yellow and the blue, those are your consciousness. One is the automatized part of your consciousness. It could have automatized as a result of deliberation. So all your automatized functioning. And then on the blue side is all your deliberate functioning. So that's what your consciousness is doing. Then you're doing action. So this is the red one is actually a bodily action. You have to actually move. You have to actually speak. All of that basic action of doing that connects us as makes us a biological being. And then we are acting in this large economic, social system. And that's the green. So the red and green are the external parts. And so the question of design is really kind of at the center. You're trying to kind of continuously improve the forms, continuously looking at the functions, continuously tinkering with them, creating new things that take care of problems. So the design function is all at the center. Okay. Next up is Paul. Paul, go ahead.
Okay. How come I am? First of all, thank you for the presentation. Quite impressed, quite good. But I have a simple question. Maybe simple question. I don't know if the answer is so simple. Let's put the thinkers or philosophers in the 17th century, in this case to 18th century. You will go regards principles, David Hume or Immanuel Kant?
Neither.
That's what gave me your, yeah, that's what I thought that you would say. That's the wrong answer.
Okay. What would you say, Paul?
Immanuel Kant, all the way.
Okay. All right. So I disagree on that. We disagree on that. Okay. Next up is Jeff and Jonathan. Jeff.
Hey, Shrikant. Thank you for this ambitious undertaking. Good Lord. So I want to offer you a few words that I use in the work that I do with leaders as a way of saying back to you what you're saying and just ask you a quick question about it.
Sure.
So I think of the center here is culture.
Jeff, let's do that in the takeaways, because I don't want to. It is going to be. I know that our ways of thinking are very different from each other. It's better to take it during the takeaways. But you can ask any question. Go ahead.
Okay, so I think that between sort of the culture and the structure and the system of this, do you see the structure and the system as kind of the experiment for the application of the principles?
That's a good question. So the question is, what is the relationship? What are structures? Are structures just experiments? Yes, I would say, you're creating forms using principles based on functions. So you're trying to achieve functions. In order to achieve functions, you're creating forms, you're creating structures. Structures are forms. And
I think that systems are forms as well. I think that both structures and systems are forms.
So
that's my question.
That's true. I mean, those are all forms, but they are guided. What you're doing is you're using principles. So this is how I'm going to operate. So these are like the kind of, what shall I say? It's question of virtue and values. Another way of looking at it. The principles are your guiding virtues. This is how I'm going to do it. And what you end up producing are systems which you are modifying, systems or forms or structures that you are modifying relentlessly in order to meet what you think is your function.
That's
Thank you,
why I
sir.
call them experiments.
Wonderful. Next up, Jonathan, I'll come to you in a second, but let me get other people first. So Hugo, Jyoti, and Jonathan. Hugo.
Yeah, thank you, Shrikant. Great presentation as always. My question is about, you mentioned in one of the slides about the simplification process.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering like how the, that process relates, to one of these 5 principle.
Sure. So simplify. That's a great question. So I've been trying to kind of, the purpose of coming up with these systems, these kind of 4 functions or 4 subsystems, I've been working on it for a long time. What I'm trying to do is that I'm trying to capture all of human experience in very few terms. So there is the internal world, our psyche, and there is the external world. There is our kind of biological, so you can look at this as at the top and at the bottom. And then on the left-hand side is our kind of biological heritage of our ability to move, ability to act, and ability to see patterns. And on the right-hand side is almost post-writing civilized behavior, where we are able to reason incredibly well, and we are able to build kind of large social systems. I found that this was the simplest way, after trying out many things. This was the simplest way I can try to capture everything about that I can talk about. Originally, this idea started through my meetups themselves. I found that when we studied Daniel Kahneman's System 1 and System 2, we looked at, Thinking Fast and Slow. We went through the book together as a meetup. We found that it gave us a common vocabulary to talk to each other about very complex things in psychology. And what I'm hoping to do with this is to extend that to kind of cover kind of all of human experience, that it'll create kind of common terms. And it is as a result of relentlessly kind of paring down and combining things that I've come up with this. Is that what you're asking?
Yes, basically, the way I see it, yeah, that was a great answer, and that confirms, my thoughts about, when you gave the example of, this meetup, to explain, the function and the forms. And I find this meetup really fascinating. And, speaking about, being simple, this is one of the meetups that I, really can follow, because like you said, it's been like divided into like these different, sections, like between the presentation and the Q&A and the breakout rooms and the takeaways. I find it like really consistent and simple to follow. And yeah, I can confirm that, like putting things simply sometimes can really like help in the long run. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Hugo. Next up is Jyoti and Jonathan. Jyoti?
Yeah, I was wondering if your personal belief system has anything to do with your formation of principles?
Absolutely. I mean, the thing is, the belief system. So the question is that's very good. See, what happens is that the need for principles is very old and very deep in humanity. And so let's look at principles, kind of chronologically, right? Even in the evolutionary stage, people basically believed in their own family and their elders, and they were guided by them. So they have a belief system that is based on that. The principles Jyoti, I'm going to mute you because there is this feedback. Okay. So even in that stage, you have got certain belief systems. They are not at the level of principles like that people can name, but they are belief systems, even at that level. Then you move to cities and you look at kind of early religions. Those are belief systems. Those are a set of principles. And at that stage, they are explicit principles of saying, this is how you live. Okay, so those are definitely principles. And what the reason that they existed was that they made possible successful operation of a city, so that people didn't kill each other. People did not hurt each other. People could work together in a city. And that's what, the function of the principles was. And as you progress, so you have to take in, your question now at kind of, so that's the connection between belief systems and principles. Now, when you fast forward to the present day, what you have to do is that you have to integrate all your, belief systems. The question is, what is a belief system? So belief system is, whatever you hold as true. So this would be your values. This could be your virtues. It could be your view of the world. What is the world like? What is existence like? What are people like? What should you do? And all of that, what principles are, our principles are crystallization of that, stating them in most explicit, clear terms and seeing the relationships between them. I don't know whether that answers the question, Jyoti.
Sort of.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Next up is Jonathan and Kate. Jonathan.
Thanks, Shrikant. So I'll give you two and then you just pick whichever one you want.
Sure.
So I was trying to think about the distinction or the difference between a theory and a principle. And all I've thought so far is maybe a principle guides action as well. So getting your thoughts on that. And then if you could, so pick which one you want to talk about. And then maybe if you can also give an example of a time where you've used one of your principles where you were going to make a mistake and then you consciously thought, okay, here are my principles. I missed that. And then you put it in action. So whichever one you want to.
Sure. So, theory is a much larger body of knowledge. So it is like, it's like a worldview. It is saying this is how things work. It is a much larger body of knowledge than principles. Principles is like a short capturing. It's always a sentence. I'll say this is the principle. So it is like an element. So many times theories can be built out of principles, but not necessarily so. Theory could be like saying, let's say a theory of atoms. Let's say world is made out of atoms, or something like that. So it's a body of knowledge, which is a complex body of knowledge, which has its parts and relationships and arguments inside it, whereas principle is a statement. The example of where I would do that, I mean, the great thing about these four things, having all these five things together, is that I can, sometimes one or the other really makes a difference. So for example, I would be interacting with somebody and I would tend to, if I did not watch, I say, okay, I'm about to say this, or I'm about to do this. Okay. Then if I say, okay, let me update my prior. So I can say, emotionally, I feel like doing this right now, but let me see, where is this coming from? And is this the right thing? So it's in terms of kind of correcting, update the priors is the most powerful way. It's a powerful correction mechanism of all these five. It is the most immediately powerful corrective mechanism, because what it is that it really captures our deliberative faculty. It is directing, it is our faculty of directing attention to things in real time. So the kinds of examples that you're asking about all most of them will come from this, engaging the deliberative faculty. the things that work on, like, for example, integrate with society, I would say, for example, I'm saying, okay, what is this? What should be the series of meetups I should plan? There, I would say, okay, whatever plan I have, how does it integrate with the society? So if I'm looking at life, say 20 years from now, what should I be doing now? What kind of meetup should I be doing now so that it will have the maximum impact for me and others? So that's like that actually raises the bar of the standard. Okay. So I'll use, for example, let's take meetups. Okay. Planning of meetups, right? And let me show you how all these things I can bring to bear. So the example was, when I say integrate with the society, with civilization, it immediately raises the bar of saying, okay, what is it that I'm not carrying that I should carry? Am I doing a good enough job? Am I, I'm just delighted with these meetups. Okay. It's just amazing people showing up, amazing conversation, but what more is possible? So it just kind of raises the standards. Okay. So that's what the, integrating with the civilization does. The updating my priors is a reminder is that it's always easy to get into a habit of doing certain things. So this is saying, okay, let me question each of the elements here. And are they all doing equally well? Or are there some elements which are carrying most of the weight and some things that are actually negative? Let me look for those. So that's a way of kind of updating the prior, looking at this thing and checking, looking at the system and checking it. Looking at intuitions, I'm saying, okay, when is it that I'm kind of feeling, look, this is not right, or this part is not right? And am I listening to it closely enough to kind of come to identify problems that are not explicit yet, but that are there at the thing? In terms of pursue my values, I'm gonna say, okay, how much of my values what values am I not pursuing through these meetups? Is there anything else I can do to pursue my values? So this is a way in which I can take something like, planning of meetups and come up with completely new, new ideas on each of them. Next, last one is Kate, and then we're going to go for breakout rooms. Kate.
Yeah, so when you were talking about civilization functioning as a bigger entity, it sounded to me like rules. And I'm wondering if principles are between beliefs and rules, or how do you distinguish a principle from a rule?
Sure. See, what principle is general, is more general than a rule. Rules are more specific generalizations that implement the principle. So for each principle to be applied to a particular area, you could come up with a bunch of rules. So it's like, it's a way of, it's not, many times principle itself is sufficient, but many times in order to say, okay, form follows function in Meetup, what rules do I need to have? And so rules is a way of codifying how do you apply a principle in a given context. All right, folks. So I'm going to start.
Can I ask you a little bit of a lead on from that?
Sure.
Would a rule lead to changing a principle? I mean, when would you change your principle?
I wouldn't say rule would lead to changing your principle, because the way I see rules, as rules come from principles that are a way of implementing the principles. What would change the principle is that diagram that I was talking about of the hourglass diagram. You're doing a whole bunch of action based on principle, and you're always updating your prior. So you're always saying, is there anything wrong? Am I taking anything for granted? Am I making a mistake here? And you're using that continuously, and changes and modifications of principles will come from that process of both, taking action on your principles and watching the results of it, and taking in new information and using that to kind of do a reinduction in order to modify the principles. So that it would come through that process, but kind of feedback mechanisms of various kinds. All right, folks. Wonderful. So I'm going to start the breakout rooms now. I'm going to run it for 20 minutes. And then when you come back, let me know what your takeaways are. Starting the breakout rooms now.